much for that nice introduction. And also thank you very much to Meshworks, Mesh Energy for having me. Yes, I'll be talking about how to build less, an introduction to the embodied carbon impacts of retrofitting. Give a little bit about me, even though I know that's definitely been covered. Very briefly, why now? And what's it got to do with carbon? A couple of things on how do we retrofit more buildings, and then ending on what does a good retrofit look like in terms of embodied carbon, highlighting the upcoming UK net zero carbon building standard and what the proposal is there. And then ending on a summary and actions for tomorrow. And obviously loads of questions which will be coming in, hopefully, in the chat. Right. So, yep, already had a little bit of an introduction about me. I'm the embodied carbon lead for UK structures. I do actually have experience working on a few retrofit projects in the Southwest as a structural engineer and structural job lead. I also completed my engineering doctorate in 2016 on developing material selection strategies to improve the embodied impacts of buildings. So things other than embodied carbon, even though embodied carbon seems to be like at the fore. But other than that, on my CV, I would say that I focus on action and ensuring that we don't lose sight of creating an equitable and just transition to a low carbon future. That's my goal. Little bit about Buro Happold. You might well have heard of us. We have offices from San Francisco all the way to Melbourne and Jakarta. We work in a number of sectors. Our main sort of bulk of people are in the UK, in our Bath office and in our London office. And we also have a dedicated sort of conservation and retrofitting team as well. We work over loads of different sectors. We started off in structures, but we definitely added over the years. And we're also adding more and more now. I'm sort of looking into embodied carbon advisory work and planning application advisory in terms of embodied carbon, reuse feasibility, focusing on all the different aspects of reuse, and definitely there's more developing as well. So why now? Construction is greedy. So it's the largest consumer of raw materials. It produces 33% of the world's overall waste and also 37% of the world's energy and process carbon dioxide emissions. And that was in 2022, which is the latest figures that we have. We have a housing crisis and empty high streets. So the figures that I had, which were the latest, were that the UK had over 170,000 empty commercial buildings up to September 2019. And also in terms of housing, England has over 260,000 long-term empty homes, Scotland over 46,000, and Wales around about 22,000 long-term empty homes as well. The climate emergency is in the minds of everyone. It's in the mind of our public and politics. So 93% of Europeans believe climate change is a serious problem. The UK actually has some of the first climate change refugees. So people from the town of Fairbairn in Wales will actually be underwater with our projected sea level rises by 2050. And also back when we did have a general election, it was the first ever climate debate. So I'm hoping that we have another climate debate ahead of our next general election before January next year. Where the public and politics are, banks and financial institutions typically follow. In around about sort of 2020, the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative set up the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which supports banks transitioning towards net zero. So that's kind of covers around about 74 trillion total assets and around about 41% of global banking assets as well. Where the money is, typically clients go because of funding concerns, planning concerns, and also public image concerns. So the Better Buildings Partnership was pulled together by lots of different portfolio clients, developer clients, to align their net zero and sustainability ambitions. There's also guidance in delivering local net zero for local governments. And then there are other sort of science-based targets or race to zero initiatives for us to demonstrate that we are heading towards net zero carbon. And then also for practitioners as well, individual practitioners will have set their own targets to tackle the climate emergency. But then there are other groups as well. You've got LETI and ACAN, who I would say are leading the way in terms of policy reform and bringing this to the fore. We have the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which I'll talk about a little bit more. The Built Environment Carbon Database, which has already been launched and is in the process of, being refined. We have construction declares a climate and biodiversity emergency, and then we also have the industry proposed document Z, which looks to try and get embodied carbon into our building regulations as well. So what's carbon got to do with it? A lot of what I've mentioned about the climate emergency is about net zero carbon. And a quick definition about net zero carbon. To keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees C, as called for in the Paris Agreement, which is the agreement supported by countries all over the world as a limit for our carbon emissions to stave off climate catastrophe. Emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. So we need to reduce the amount of carbon we're emitting in the first place. And then also any remaining emissions need to be offset, either through carbon emissions removal, which is things like planting trees, or avoidance, which is a bit more difficult to explain in a short space of time, but it means sort of limiting the release of carbon emissions into the atmosphere from carbon sinks. So things like the conversion of grassland into croplands or potentially flue gas capture. And then the amount of carbon that you're emitting needs to be equal to at least to the carbon that's being offset. And so you're at a net of zero. But is it enough? There is a lot of, there are quite a few issues around offsetting. Some people calling it carbon colonialism, and it's quite murky. There's been quite a few articles on, the viability of it and actually whether or not it's the way we should be going. And also, is net zero enough? We had the world's first long year breach of a key 1.5 degrees C warning. So is zero enough, or should we really be aiming to go negative? Net zero carbon is about carbon emissions, and carbon emissions fall into two main camps. When we're talking about buildings, which is what I'll focus on, the whole life carbon emissions of that building are the sum of the operational carbon emissions. And so these are the emissions due to the operation of a building, so heating, power, electrical systems, etc. Because typically for energy, our energy mixes will have, if you're just getting typical grid energy, we're at around about 40% renewables. So that means that 60% of our energy is coming from sources that will have carbon emissions associated with them. So there'll be carbon associated with the operation of your building. And embodied carbon, which is the emissions from making, maintenance, and disposal of building materials. So essentially, all of the carbon emissions associated with producing a brick, so the digging up of the clay, the processing of it, the firing of it, the transportation of that brick to site, all of those carbon emissions can be calculated on a per brick basis, and that will be the embodied carbon of that brick. Are embodied carbon emissions and operational carbon emissions equal? Well, with the decarbonisation of our energy grid and more efficient building systems, embodied carbon is already a much bigger percentage of the building's whole life than before, and this will only continue over time. Also, to put embodied carbon into context, if we were to take an example, 6,000 meter squared office building, I've defined it as a LETI grade E, which is a business as usual office building, would potentially have an upfront embodied carbon of 5,700 tons. That's the equivalent of flying from London to New York and back every day for 9 years and 2 months, or since March 2015. So our responsibility as built environment professionals, I would argue, vast outweighs our responsibility as regular citizens because of just the sheer difference that we can make when we look at the buildings that we produce in our day-to-day jobs. And what is the lowest embodied carbon option that we have for the built environment? It's to use what we already have. So according to the RICS whole life carbon assessment for the built environment, a free to download document, which I would consider is the holy grail for learning about whole life carbon assessments within the UK. The quantities used within existing assets that are to be retained, we don't need to determine the impacts of the embodied carbon of what's already there within modules A1 to A5. So if we were to look at the carbon emissions of a building over time, modules A1 to A5 cover everything up to practical completion. Modules B1 to B7 cover everything to the operation of the building, including things like replacement and maintenance cycles, and then all of the C modules are end of life. So if we don't need to take into account the embodied carbon of existing assets, it means that this initial A1 to A5 embodied carbon can be vastly reduced. And that's why the embodied carbon impacts of retrofitting buildings really need to be explored and made the most of, especially in a country such as the UK, where we have so much existing building stock as well, and so much of it that is lying empty. So that's a theory and why we need to do this, but how do we actually get around to it? I'll be talking about essentially a build nothing and a build less approach. So this sort of build nothing, build less, build clever, build efficiently strategy for reducing our carbon emissions was put forward by the World Green Building Council. And it really highlights that the earlier that you talk about things such as retrofitting, the more impact you can have. If we focus on sort of build nothing and build less, we get to challenge the root cause for a building and also maximize the use of existing assets by really focusing on the design and focusing on that being a key point early on. So one way that we need to do this is we need a mindset shift. We need to move from the unchallenged requirements of a building and then producing a new building to suit those requirements, to really focusing on having an existing building and then adjusting our requirements for that building. And how do we do that? We need to reduce and interrogate the brief so that we can ensure that we're using the building to the best of its ability. So one way is to reduce the amount of space that one thinks you need within an existing building. Can it be things such as, space requirements? Can you work from home? Can certain spaces become multifunctional spaces? Do you need to have a separate, for example, lecture theatre and seminar space? Can we use outdoor spaces? If we've got a provision for needing more meeting spaces, can sort of covered outdoor spaces fulfill that brief in certain ways? Can certain requirements be hosted elsewhere? If you need to be able to have sort of meeting areas for over 50 people. Is there something, can we enter into agreements with other spaces elsewhere that can have that particular function, so that you can actually make the use of the existing building or the building that you have to retrofit in the first place. Now's where I want to share like a build nothing retrofit. Like, what could this kind of imaginative way of considering interrogating the brief to prioritize retrofitting look like? This is a photo from Barcelona, where they have essentially taken back control over the roadways so that they can create high quality public spaces, parks, spaces for local cafes as well. So rather than necessarily needing to build a new park, they took back the road, the space dedicated to cars in this particular location, and gave it back to the community to create those community spaces there. Another way that we can shift our mindsets is to, I mentioned sort of challenging space requirements, but another way is to sort of challenge column-free spaces, challenge loading requirements as well. Typically, existing buildings, the ones I've come across anyway, tend to have smaller column grids than buildings that we're building new. Like, do we need to have a 9x9 grid, or can we make do with a 5.5 by 6 meter grid for certain functions? Again, existing buildings will have specific loading capacity within them, but can we challenge those loading requirements? For example, the room that you can see in the image on the right hand side there, that's with people very close together, 29 people, and that's around about 1.4 kilonewtons per meter squared in that space there. A lot lower than what you typically design for with crowds, which is around about sort of 5-ish, so much reduced. In terms of plant rooms, this is where my structural engineering comes in. But with things like plant rooms, we typically assume a 7.5 kilonewtons per meter squared loading for plant rooms. However, air handling units are typically mostly air. So if we really interrogate what we know plant rooms need to do, we can pretty much half the amount of loading that's required within that space, and therefore minimize the amount of strengthening that we might need to do to an existing building, or just have the possibility of having your plant room spaces on existing structure. Another thing is to challenge serviceability requirements. I've got a very sort of tongue-in-cheek example down here where, 12 degrees C, do you need to have lots of heaters? This is for a stadium. Do you need to have lots of heaters to keep people warm, or do you sort of trust that people will tend to be okay with 12 degrees C if they're watching football matches? These kinds of things, we tend to have our assumptions or our starting points for what we design for. But if we're really serious about retrofitting, we need to try and challenge these. And it might be that actually, 9 times out of 10, the assumptions that you did make are the ones that are necessary for that particular space. But, that 1 time out of 10, if it means that you can save material, or it makes the reuse of a certain building actually feasible now, it's still worth the win. Another thing for retrofitting is we need to restructure how we work on projects. Typically, I would say that we have quite light touch at really early REBA stages, and then sort of ramp up when we need to do a bit more technical design on, spatial coordination, getting your reinforcement quantities for your beams, really sort of honing what your MEP strategy would be, etc. But what we need for retrofitting is to really shift this effort forward. There's a lot more that needs to be done early stage for feasibility, challenging those requirements, also identifying which buildings might actually be best for you to retrofit as well. So how do we do that? Bringing in the right consultants at REBA stage one, ensuring that the site that you've selected is appropriate, or if there's a case of purchasing certain sites, whether there's been appropriate support in ensuring that you're buying the right site with the right assets on it for your brief. Understanding reuse feasibility and doing those really early sort of feasibility studies so that you can work on that brief and work on what is actually necessary for this new project, using the buildings that you may already have. It's also at this stage that we really should pay attention to inclusive design. What interventions are needed for an inclusive retrofit as well, and what analytics and or building physics is required, so that we have high quality indoor and outdoor spaces. Is there enough scope for daylight autonomy? Is there enough scope for things like ventilation, etc.? This is also where it's really key to ensure that we're aware that we're not getting carbon tunnel vision as well. Even though, yes, I'm the embodied carbon lead for UK structures, I'm very aware that because carbon can be measured, it feels like it's the only thing that gets focused on. And I was told that there are a couple of passive house designers here, and I'm sure that you are probably struggling with the arguments or the tensions that can arise between carbon and really high quality energy performance. So I think, with this sort of trying to shift the effort forwards, get the right experts into the room early stages, and also changing the way that the fees work, so that there is more fee available at those early stages, so that an actually feasible assessment of a retrofit is completed to a high quality. It's key that carbon emissions don't become the be all or end all at these really early stages, with those relatively high levels of uncertainty as well. It's also here that it's worth noting that actually retrofitting has really key benefits for the circular economy in terms of ensuring that we make use of the high quality resources that we already have in situ, and not try and get more new building materials created. We're really trying to focus on what we can already use that's already within the system. We also need to challenge our views on retrofitting. Sometimes people who might not be as aware of what retrofitting can look like might think that it's an either or situation. Either you get a dingy building with a lick of paint on it, or new, which is shiny and it fulfills all of your needs and dreams and wishes, etc. When actually it's a lot more nuanced than that. I like to think of retrofitting using brands shearing layers, where we look at a building as different layers of permanence. So moving from the social, so the people that can move around in the space, so that permanence is impermanent really, because people move around your spaces quite often. The stuff and the space plan, so that can change week on week, it can change month on month. Then increasing impermanence, you've got things like your building services and your facade, which can vary between 10 and 30-ish years. And then sort of moving into your more permanent elements of a building. So structure should be there for the lifespan of the building, so around about sort of 50 to 60 years, which can be then extended as well. And then site and surroundings, which are a lot more permanent. So taking different retrofitting examples that I know of from Buro Happold, this is where I can see the different levels of permanence really being addressed here. So our analytics team worked on sort of the people flow analysis of the current UCL Institute of Neurology. So their sort of layout at feasibility created quite a uniform potential for interaction. And what they were really keen on was changing up the layout that they had put forward so that they could have a bit more sort of dynamism in their space to create a nice environment for their academics and students, etc. And actually, through people flow modeling, they changed that layout. They changed the space plan to create hotspots for interactions, but also create much more quiet spaces for deeper work, and also for certain neurodiversity traits. You might get really sort of annoyed or distracted by loud sounds when you're trying to work. So this actually created a lot more of an inclusive space as well. Looking into retrofitting, where we impact the services and the skin of a building. This is the Appleton Tower in Edinburgh. So what happened was all of the old plant at the top was removed and the facade was improved. And actually, as a result of those changes, there was enough space to actually create a cafe at the top of this particular tower. And also, that's because the energy performance of the fabric and higher systems with higher efficiencies were able to be used as well. Moving on to what we would consider maybe more typical retrofitting. Bristol Aero, which was the conversion of an old hangar into a space that was appropriate to house these kind of historical pieces. So there need to be great changes in the internal environment for the aircraft hangars so that they were kept appropriately at the appropriate sort of humidities and temperatures, but also make it a nice space for the people to walk around as well in that particular museum. Another sort of newer example is Newark Works. So this was the conversion of an old factory that used to make cranes into a multi-function office space. So the load-bearing masonry, roof trusses were kept. There needed only minor strengthening to the roof trusses, which was great. The ground floor slab and a majority of the suspended floor slabs were also retained. But we did need some new load-bearing walls, which were completed in timber stud work. There needed to be some new suspended slabs in certain areas, and then also a new blockwork core for stairs and lifts, along with associated concrete foundations for that. Because quite a bit was retained, it actually scored around about an A on our internal structures embodied carbon tool, which was great. And then another example that we have for Temple Quarter Research Hub, this needed a bit more of an intervention. So we needed a new ground floor slab. We had to replace the existing roof trusses. So there was a new steel portal roof. But also quite a few sort of CLT interventions as well. So there was some load-bearing CLT, so cross-laminated timber, for those that might not be aware of what CLT stands for, and some suspended floors in CLT. And as a result of this difference in intervention, the embodied carbon performance for this was actually a bit lower. It was a D. So I think this leads us on to the next slide, which is what does a good retrofit look like in terms of embodied carbon? So our assessments of the embodied carbon of retrofit, we're currently measuring it against new build targets, and we make full use of the gross internal floor area that we have in the final condition. But what I'm going to talk about now is the upcoming UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which will hopefully try and allow us to compare apples with retrofitting. So the draft of this standard is to be issued in summer, sorry, not summary, issued in summer of 2024. If you're not aware of what the standard is about, it's the UK's first cross-industry net zero carbon standard that brings together the requirements for all major building types based on a 1.5 degrees C trajectory. It's been pulled together by over 300 built environment professionals across the UK. All of the bodies that are mentioned in a line at the bottom of the slide are involved. And it aims to recognise the demand for coordination, a single agreed methodology, to demonstrate industry progress to net zero, and also, and I think this is the key thing, align our existing initiatives and standards together as well. I think the key thing that they don't want is for it to be a standard that is yet another standard that's used alongside other ones that are used in the UK. It's already quite a complex topic, and so they're very aware that this should be sort of the single source of truth for net zero carbon design, but also building on the really good work that lots of other groups, including Letty, have worked towards as well. So they actually give a definition for retrofitting. So their definitions are for retrofitting mixed new and retrofit and new build. So retrofit is defined as more than 25% of the building envelope is renovated, or there's a substantial replacement of building services. And there will be retrofit embodied carbon limits given there. On the other side of the coin, we've got new build, which is defined as where more than 50% of the existing slab area is demolished, and new build embodied carbon limits must be met there. And then we have the kind of slightly murky space in the middle where you've got the mixed new and retrofit. So this is where less than 50% of existing slab area is demolished, and the building may be extended in a certain way, for example, extended sideways or more floors on top, as we see with a couple of higher-rise buildings around the UK. And for this, a pro rata approach based on the gross internal floor area should be taken to identify the embodied carbon limit based on how much is being added as new and how much has actually been retrofitted. This is a working definition that I'm aware of, and it will be sort of finalised when the draft is issued in summer. But this approach allows for all retrofit projects and their embodied carbon to be measured against each other equally, which is, the key thing here.
Natasha, on that slide there, and
apologies,
on your Temple Quarter project, where
yes.
would that fit into within these new definitions?
That is a very good question. I don't know the specifics in terms of what has been removed and what has been added, but I would hazard a guess to say it was a mixed new and retrofit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you mentioned about how it needed a new slab, didn't it?
It did, yeah.
So I just, on that basis, and going back to the Temple Quarter, you sort of have how do you define what's a good retrofit? I mean, in terms of the feasibility and the understanding right at the start for that building, what was the motivation for not knocking it down and repurposing it? Did it come from an embodied carbon, or was it from a cost perspective? Like what all of these considerations, who was leading that, and what was the main driver for just as an example on that project? And because you said that one sort of straddled the two.
Yeah, so I believe that it was a mixture of different incentives. It would be a little bit to do with cost, a little bit to do with planning, a little bit to do with the carbon intentions of the client as well. there is more about that particular project on our website. I don't want to necessarily say something that's incorrect, but
Yeah,
if
so
we're going
I
to be
didn't mean to
sharing,
ask a question.
no, 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 it's fine.
No, it was just because it was one of those ones where
Where it
um
is a bit of a
yeah,
mix.
yes, yeah.
Um, yeah, I will. I'll see if I can get a bit more information about it and share it when the recording of this goes
Yeah,
out.
yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah,
it's only because it came up on the it was
of
just
course.
with the new retrofit definitions. Right. No,
Yeah,
I'll crack on, sorry.
no, it's all right. It's good to ask questions. Um, the retrofit limits for embodied carbon are to be based on the new build limits that will be stated within the standard. But what will be different is there will be a retrofit factor applied. So this retrofit factor will be given for each building element, and it will be dependent on the sector that that building element is also part of as well, which is again, another reason why I believe there's been a bit of a delay to the issuing of the draft version of the standard. Um, it will also be based on the typical replacement scenarios during retrofitting. It will be based on the typical replacement scenarios for that sector as well. For example, the replacement scenarios for offices will be quite different from the replacement scenarios for a hospital, which will be different for a school, etc. And they'll represent expected upper bound emissions as a proportion of the original emissions for the equivalent new build. So they'll be slightly conservative. Um, and what's great about this is that this new approach incentivizes efficient retrofitting and ensures continual improvement while still being simple for the user. So even though I've given you a bit of a breakdown as to what the retrofitting factor will be based on, a user of the standard will just use whatever that retrofit factor will be, which will be a number. So, summary and actions for tomorrow. A whistle-stop tour through quite a few topics, but key takeaways are that retrofitting existing buildings is a principal way of reducing the carbon emissions of the construction industry and to move us towards a circular economy. The earlier the potential for retrofitting is discussed, the more likely it is to be a success. Retrofitting is not binary. There are many different levels and extents of retrofitting, and ensuring that you get the right balance between a low carbon project and one that works for its users is key. So what to do tomorrow? Speak to your team. If we're all built environment professionals, speak about how you could feature retrofitting on your next project. It doesn't matter if it's only a small step. Maybe it's reusing, you know, 5% of the building, 10% of the building, but we all have to start somewhere. So yeah, I think that's where I'd like to end. So yes, I'd love to hear from you. That's my email address if you want to get in touch, and hopefully there'll be some questions.
No, thank you very much, Natasha.
Thank you.
Fantastic presentation. Yeah, I'm glad you spent a lot of time putting that together. So no, really appreciate that. Just on Claire mentioned one thing going back to the early. She made a comment just talking when you were talking about utilizing space differently.
Yeah.
And I mean, Claire just made a point about thinking holistically, 6 times 7.5 meter deep, 3 meter floor to floor. We can use natural daylight ventilation to further reduce CO2. So just talking about how we
Mm.
can consider repurposing or thinking differently about using that particular space. In terms of the mindset shift, which is a lot of this is prefaced on really. I mean, you talk about fees and having to get consultants moving that shift from later REAP stages to earlier stages and looking at the fees available, etc. I mean, Mesh Energy is obviously a consultant, and we're always advocating people engage with us earlier. But the reality is, who's picking up that bill? I mean, how does that fee structure work? Because prior to planning and all of these things, there's sort of sunken costs. So some of that change in mindset not only just a
Yeah.
change in mindset, it's just it's quite a challenging change in mindset when it comes to
Oh,
getting.
definitely. Yeah. I know that for well, one of the arguments that we've put forward before is that well, definitely in London, where you need to have your your discussion piece on
Yeah.
circularity for the building, but also with certain local authorities saying you need to have a really strong reason for demolition, and then
Hmm.
also your carbon studies for the GLA.
Yeah.
Um, all of that uh, uh, requires time and
Hmm.
fee. And so it's, well, what would be the cost of not getting planning first time?
Yeah.
And sort of trying to balance it that way. Does it make sense to pay extra now
Yeah.
to really
Twice.
have a
Yeah.
solid case if you did want to partially demolish or
Hmm.
whatever now? And actually, if that isn't strong enough for the local authority and they say rejected, like what is the cost of having to go through the planning process again? Um, which hasn't meant that we've gotten a lot of money, but it
No.
can mean that, you get that little bit extra so you can do what you can with that fee.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a to and fro because, all projects are unique ventures on unique locations with a unique group of people for a unique purpose. So
Yeah.
yeah.
But I think, as you say, that but if that process does start to change and people will realize that they know with proper feasibility, they're reducing the risk of paying twice
Yes.
in right at the start. Raina, would you like to come off mute? You talk about LA policy perspective. Just be interested to hear your thoughts.
Sure, thank you. Hi, Natasha. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I was just wondering because exactly what you were talking about and moving on from it, like what is enough for a decent retrofit? Like what is you mentioned 5 to 10% is a good step to get started on. Obviously, it would depend on the kind of building, the kind of retrofit, the kind of end users, all of the variables. But I mean, I'm talking from a completely local authority point of view. What should we be doing towards it? Introducing an embodied carbon policy, sure, but how can we deal with this at this level essentially? And I'm not expecting an answer. Sorry, this is probably yeah.
I would say that if you haven't already, looking at the policies that London has at the moment, either the wider sort of GLA or looking at people working for, I think Camden Council is the one that I'm most familiar with. Westminster
Yeah.
Council, I think, are pretty hot on these topics.
Mm-hmm.
So, speaking to contacts or second 2 degrees of separation people about what they've seen work for them, I think is a really good starting point. Um, Something that I've seen recently was with the conversion of light industrial spaces.
Yeah.
There's usually a lot of concrete apron, and that's a lot of material. And so, if the landscaping can actually work with that concrete external slab and not mean that it all has to be broken out and dug up and like thrown away, that's a really good starting point, because I'm sure that there are really creative ways that landscape architects can work with that. And a good couple of there's a really lovely example in South Korea, where an old air I think it's an old runway was converted into a park, and they did keep quite a lot of the existing runway and made it part of the landscape architecture. Um, I would say that's I don't want to say an easy way, because I'm sure that there's a lot of stuff that I've glossed over. I'm not a landscape architect, but I think embracing what is already on site for the externals um, is a really good start, because then you don't have, the building aspects of it. And if you can make something, if you can create those spaces to discuss it for the external spaces, hopefully, maybe the slightly more complex um, aspects of trying to retrofit a building can come along from that.
And outside of London as well, I mean, we
Mm.
as Mesh, there's a lot of local authorities that are requiring embodied carbon analysis when it comes to either demolishing a house or retrofitting or building new, because so more, especially down in the southwest, that's happening more and more.
Mm.
And even the councils that don't have such a policy, the some of the planners are wondering why they don't have that policy. So
Mm.
it's all coming down the line. I think there's around in the Surrey area, they don't have such a policy, but I know from conversations there that will happen. So yeah, it's the regs are going to catch up with us here. Interestingly, you just mentioned about South Korea and everything,
Yeah.
and another place, Natasha, as an organization that straddles different continents. Where's is the UK? There's a big drive within the UK towards net zero. Are you seeing that across other regions as well? Are we sort of leading the way? And what are other offices and regions doing? Can you learn from them, or are they learning from us?
Um, so I am in touch with our structural and sustainability people from other countries, and I would say that in the US with SE 2050, which is a structural engineering sustainability group, you need to submit embodied carbon calculations to stay on the list, which I don't think I've seen. It definitely in the UK, not seen it. In We have a Rotterdam office, and they have much sort of stricter circular economy requirements, which is great to see. Our Copenhagen office, I think it's part of building regulations that you've got a set sort of embodied carbon per year of life that needs to be adhered to. But in terms of things like the nuance between different elements, so the nuance between energy efficiency and embodied carbon, ensuring that policy planning policy is in the right place, and that there's enough knowledge exchange so that planners feel equipped and able to question consultants on certain embodied carbon or whole life carbon assessments. I think the UK is doing quite well. We do a lot more of that kind of discussion aspects that I haven't seen as mentioned within our other offices. So
Okay.
we all have our different
No,
different
absolutely,
abilities.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose talking about planning, I mean, and planning's clearly key,
Mm.
and I'm assuming there were stakeholders from the planning community within the working group for the new standard, but
Yeah.
it doesn't help when something like M&S Marble Arch is, they're now allowed to demolish that. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
yeah, difficult when such a landmark store is no longer going to be retrofit. So it's just yeah, a lot of work, a lot of work to do there, but we know that anyway.
Exactly. And I think it's where the balance between like a high quality space and retrofitting needs to be. I mean, there's been some really poor examples of retrofits of commercial spaces into social housing,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's not dignified. It's not a good environment. We've also had a look at a project where it was an old school which had asbestos in it and was really poorly performing. It made a lot less sense to retrofit that than to build a new school,
Yeah.
especially when you're thinking about, the education of kids and stuff like that. But there was an issue because there were some pretty vocal residents of that particular location that had heard the carbon argument and were campaigning what they said was, a really important climate issue.
Yeah.
And I think I completely get where they're coming from. But in this particular instance, it wasn't the right decision,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think it's where the nuance and the balance, where does that lie, and
Yeah.
who gets to set that balance?
Well, that's when you start saying about how we need to bring the efforts in, considering all of these thoughts much
Exactly.
much earlier in the process. But no, not an easy task. But no, thank you very much indeed, Natasha. That's been a fantastic presentation. I'll upload this. I'll share the recording with everyone, and I'll upload this later this week. And no, thanks for taking your time to join us, and thank you very much to everyone else for joining too. Great to
Yes.
see everyone.
Thanks again for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you. Cheers,
Thank
guys.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.